Hey guys, this is Charlie, your Photoshop 2 instructor. This is going to be a video walkthrough of everything we covered in class. I'll probably end up going in a little bit of a different order or describing things in a slightly different way, so if there's anything that throws you off or you have any questions going on in the future with anything you work on in Photoshop, feel free to reach out. My email's right here on the screen, raycharles@gmail.com. I'd be happy to answer any questions about this walkthrough and what we learned in class, or anything else that comes up as you're using Photoshop in the coming months. So in this class, this is what we ended up making. This is our project here. We ended up editing all these different photo assets, doing some light compositing, putting photos together, and then we ended up bringing it all together into an artboard to create a desktop website mockup, and then also a parallel mobile version of that website. So that's what we'll be working on together. And let's see, the first thing you want to do is open up Adobe Bridge. If you don't have Adobe Bridge, you can always use Finder on a Mac or Windows Explorer on a PC. What I love about Adobe Bridge is it's meant for working on images. You can drag and drop folders over here on the left side and create favorites, so you can shortcut to these. If I click on any one of these, it'll take me directly to that folder. So if you have a folder where you store all your photos, or someplace at work where you're going to all the time repeatedly, that's super handy for that. You can also rank or label your photos. So if you hold Control on a PC or Command on a Mac and then hit 1 through 5 on your keyboard, it'll add a star. So Command 1 will put a 1 star, 3 stars, 5 stars, and then Command or Control 0 will take it back to 0, no stars at all. And then Command 6, 7, 8, or 9 will add a label. So Command 8 will turn it green, Command 6 red, so on and so forth, and then just hit the same again in order to get rid of it. So Control or Command 6 again will get rid of that label. Super handy for labeling your photos if you have ones you want to keep, ones you want to get rid of, or just be more eye-catching so you can get back to the file you were working on. So if you have Bridge open and you've got all your files downloaded for this class, we're going to go into the 3 products folder. You can just double click or click on that and then hit enter. Then the first image we're going to be working on is this gray pot here. We're going to build a website mockup for this local company that makes these kind of rustic home goods. So you can either double click on that gray file or click on it and then hit enter, and it should open in Photoshop. Before we get started working on it, double check your workspace. You want to be able to see history. Your history might be right here in a different kind of a panel. That's totally fine. Properties and layers. If yours looks nothing like this, come up here to Window and then Workspace and click on Essentials, and that should take you to a view that looks pretty similar to this and has all of these options. So before we get started, I'm going to quickly review the building blocks that we're really going to focus on throughout this class. These are the things that will help you edit non-destructively. And you always want to edit non-destructively whenever possible. And that just means that everything you do can be easily undone. So you're not drawing on your actual original image layer there. You are doing things like adding a new layer and drawing on that so that you can always turn that on and off or delete it, and you've still got your original image. So every change, every move we make in Photoshop, we're always going to keep separate in various ways from our original image so that you can always go back to your original image. We're not destroying or distorting the original file in any way. So to quickly go over those building blocks, and then we'll kind of flesh those out as we go through each image for the website. To go over them quickly, the first one is layer. So to add a new layer, you can click on that new layer button there, and layers are super handy for keeping edits separate from your original document. You can name them, and you can draw on those layers. You can use tools on those layers. A lot of tools, like let's go to the clone stamp tool, you'll see an option like this. It's telling you sample, and you can tell it what you want it to sample. If you only want to sample this current layer, you won't be able to use the tool because it's a totally empty layer. We haven't put anything in that layer and there's no data in it yet. So in order to be able to use this tool on a blank layer like that and edit non-destructively, you'll either want current and below, or all layers if you won't have layers above this one that you want it to reference. So current and below will reference that lower layer now, and you can sample there and then use that tool even though it's on a totally separate layer. And in that way we keep our edits separate. And that's what that layer looks like. Even though it had nothing originally, we used the clone stamp. Now there's some data in it. The next type of layer we're going to use, or the next one of our building blocks that helps keep our edits separate and non-destructive, is an adjustment layer. So adjustment layers are used for just what it sounds like, adjustments. I would use the normal layer that we just looked at for more physical changes, like I want to fix, you know, this chip, that kind of thing. You're fixing something physical in your document. Adjustment layers are more for the attributes or the traits like color, brightness, contrast, all that kind of stuff. And so to add an adjustment layer, you'll come down here to this split circle in your layers panel. Click that and you've got all kinds of different adjustment layers. So let's just add let's do curves. You can throw an adjustment layer in there, and with that curves layer, you're able to edit the contrast, edit the look of your image, once again without affecting your original. You could always open this file up in 1 year, delete that curves layer, and you're right back to where you started. So the next building block we're going to use is a selection. And Photoshop uses selections in a lot of different ways. We're mainly going to use it in order to tell Photoshop where we want to create a mask. And a mask is our next building block. So just to show you here, if I create a solid color layer, let's just go with pink, and this is the mask right here. Right now it's white. If I switch it, and I'll show you guys how to do this later, to black, nothing will show up. White is where it does show up. And so if I take a brush with a black paint here and start to paint on that mask, it actually starts to erase. Once again, where it's black, your effect will not show up. Where it's white, it will show up. And once again, you can flip that back and forth. And so what we're really going to use selections for is modifying or creating our masks. So I just deleted the mask from this. If I draw a selection here using a selection tool, and then I add a mask, which is this little button right here just to the left of the adjustment layers, it's going to use that selection to create a mask, and that's mainly what we're going to be using selections for. And then our last building block is the refine selection and mask tool. And that's located up here, so we're selected onto our mask. If we go up in there, this is just for refining. You can actually create masks from this tool or from this menu from scratch, but we're going to use it to modify the ones that we already made with selections. And in this view, you've got a bunch of different options. You can see your mask in black and white. You can see it actually on your layers, what it looks like, all kinds of options. And then you've got other options right here. So feather is going to soften your edge. You can use smooth. It's not going to do much because I have pretty much all smooth curve lines on here. Shift edge will move it in and out. And it's taking a second to update there, but you can see the idea. And then contrast is going to sharpen your edges back up. And you can just use that to refine your selections and your masks, make them more accurate. None of the selection tools in Photoshop are ever really going to give you a perfect mask, so we kind of always want to refine that. So I'm going to click cancel and go back to where I started with this image, and we'll get started. And hopefully along the way we'll really be able to kind of define once again what all those building blocks are and how you would use them. So in general, when I open a photo that I need to fix something in, I like to make those physical changes using a separate layer first. And I demoed this in class, and the reason for this is that if let's just say tomorrow I decide that this image is too cold, I want to warm it up, and I go a little crazy, and I think that that looks great. And then I come in and I fix my chip, and I need my sample all layers once again checked up there. I fix my chip with that adjustment layer turned on. If I come back tomorrow and I decide, oh, that's way too warm, that looks terrible, and I delete that, I'm going to have to redo that fix I did on the chip. So it's not a solid 100% all the time rule. That's just generally the way I find most helpful to start with, is to fix any physical things within the photo, you know, chips, dust, scratches, things like that, and then go on to adding adjustments like brighten, darken, that kind of thing. So let's get started here. We want to add a layer since we want to edit non-destructively. So we're going to click this new layer button down here. And our first task with this image is we want to fix this chip so that the product can look its best on the website. So you can zoom into your product. You've got a zoom tool here. It's kind of clunky and slow. The way I usually zoom is holding Command and then using the bracket keys, and those are the two keys just to the right of the P key. The left one zooms out and the right one's going to zoom in. And if you are on a Mac or if you're on a PC, it's going to be Control and then those two. So you can zoom into your product. If you need to move around on your image, if you hold down the space bar, you can see my cursor here. When you hold down space bar, it'll turn to a hand. Then when you click and drag, you can move your document around and get to where exactly where you want to be focused. So we're going to come up here and we're selected onto that new layer. And why don't we rename it while we're here? I'm going to rename it to Chip Fix, since that's what we're going to use it for, is fixing that chip. I'm going to come up here and select the patch tool. So yours probably right now shows one of these band-aids. That's one of the healing brushes. So if you click and hold on that, it'll actually break out and you've got other tools hidden underneath. And we'll do the patch tool, the one right in the middle. So click that. And yours might be set to normal up here. We want to change that to content aware. You guys can fiddle with those in your own work and see how those are different. They definitely do act differently. In this case, we want to do content aware, and then we definitely want that sample all layers checked so that it will reference the layer below. Since our layer is currently empty, there's nothing for it to reference in that layer. So we're going to draw a selection around the chip, and then we're going to use the patch tool to hopefully patch it up. And with the patch tool, you don't have to be super precise. Make sure that you leave a bit of an edge around what you want to patch. I'll do 3 different examples here, and you can kind of see how the tool works. So if I try to stay right on the edge, which you don't want to do, and do that, let's see what it does. Did okay. There's still a bunch of the original crack down here that you'd have to fix. I'm going to go back and undo that. Let's go back to the way I did it before, but let's only take part of it this time, and let's patch. That doesn't work at all because it thinks that we don't want to fix that lower portion, and we definitely do, so it gets a little confused when you only select part of it because it thinks you only want to fix the upper part, and then it references that lower part in order to fill it, so it doesn't really do much of anything. So let's select it like we did the first time. Go around it, give it a little space on all sides. Something just like that. And if you need to add to your selection, you can hold Shift, and you can see my cursor gets a little plus next to it. You can add to your selection that way. And then if you want to remove from your selection, if you hold Option or Alt, Option for Mac, Alt for Windows, you'll see you get a little minus, and you can subtract from your selection. So if I was selecting and whoa, I went way crazy, that's not what I want at all, a quick holding down of Option or Alt, drawing around that will get rid of it. So we've got our selection. We want to patch. With Content Aware Patch, you can toggle it the tiniest little bit and it's going to start to patch. If it's not doing what you want, you can drag it and it'll give you a preview, and that gives it a little bit more of a suggestion of what you want to fill it with. You can see it filled it slightly differently that time. And I think that looks pretty good for starters. Since it filled in this lower part very well, I don't want to keep patching that. I'm just going to click over here and make a new selection around the part that I still want to fix so that it doesn't keep patching that over and maybe messing it up. And that didn't work so good, so I'm going to do a suggestive one again by scooting over. And we're looking pretty good there. I'm just going to get this brighter white part. And I think that looks pretty good, especially when we're zoomed out on the website. It's going to look great. So we fixed our chip. The other thing we want to do is brighten these products up just so that they pop out from the gray background just a little bit more. So for that, we're going to use our quick select brush up here. And with this, you can drag right through the middle of whatever you want to select, and it's going to expand outward and try and find the edges of your item. So you'll see in an area maybe like this, there's nice contrast and a nice edge between the gray background and the product, and it's going to have no problem right there. But over here where we've kind of got white on white, it's probably going to struggle a little bit. So let's start right here in the middle. We just click and hold and start drawing. And then when you let go, you can use any of these options up here. I usually like to just leave it on the first one. And then I hold Shift in order to keep adding to my selection. And then like down here where it got too much, if I want to subtract, just hold Alt or Option and go over that. And that'll subtract, take away from your selection. So I'm just going to keep holding Shift and adding here to my selection. Get the edge there, and it bumped out a little too far, so I'm going to go over to Option or Alt, hold that and subtract. Got a little bit too much there as well. Going to add again, holding Shift up here. Get our lid. And sometimes it's easiest to get everything you want first and not focus on where it might have messed up and selected too much. And now I've got pretty much everything that I want in the selection. Maybe a little bit more over here. And then I'll go back and subtract from it so that I can subtract this at once, subtract this part at once. And in a perfect world, you won't have to keep going back and forth and adding and subtracting, but I still have to here. And the quick selection brush is not great for sharp edges like this. So for something like that, I'm going to end up switching to another selection tool. I'm going to come over here to my lasso tool. And if you click and hold on that and go down to the polygonal lasso tool, this one is just for drawing straight lines. So I want to subtract that from my selection. So I'm going to hold Option or Alt, click right here, click up into that corner, down over here, and then close that selection. And it gives us a perfect, nice, sharp edge there. And then it didn't do so great down here with our white edge, so I'm just going to go to the normal lasso tool, the very top one, in that same little menu tool. Come down here, hold Shift so that I'm adding to my selection. Just add right there, and come right around the edge of that lid. Make sure I get a decently smooth edge. Maybe a little bit right there. And this doesn't have to be perfect. Like I keep saying in class, over time your selections will get better. You'll understand just at a glance at an image if your selection tool is or isn't going to work very well and which selection tool is going to work the best. And that's just via practice and trying it out on a ton of different images. And I've kind of got a bumpy edge over here, so maybe I'm going to go back to my polygonal lasso tool and hold Option so that I'm subtracting. Click down, over, up, close that, and I get a nice clean edge on there. So we've got our selection, and you can pause the video at any point, obviously, if you need to get caught up or you want to make sure your selection is perfect. So we've got our selection. Now we're going to use that selection to tell Photoshop where we want to create the adjustment that's going to brighten up these products. So if we come down here, let's add an adjustment layer since we're going to adjust them to be brighter. And let's use curves. There's a bunch of different options. You've got brightness and contrast, which is a little more limiting, only has 2 sliders. You've got exposure. I like to use curves. Curves is a little confusing at first, but it's pretty much the most powerful of all of those tools and the most flexible. So I'm going to add a curves layer. And you can see it took our selection. It's gone now. and it made it into that mask there. So the white part is where this is going to show up when we make our effect. So just to show you, if I darken, you can see it's only going to be darkening those products that we had selected, the areas we had selected. If you ever get your curve somewhere and you need to reset it, this little back arrow right here take you right back to where you were. Sometimes if you've done multiple changes, you might have to hit it a couple times to get it to go all the way back. And I'm just going to name this curves layer to Brighten Product. One thing we're really going to harp on in this walkthrough is keeping a nice tidy file, labeling all your layers so that when you get to your website build and you've got 25 layers, everything's nice and clear, really easy to work with. So we've got our mask there, and now we want to brighten up our products. So this is your curves window here, and this is kind of like a sound wave almost, just like a sound wave represents the peaks and the lows in an actual audio clip. This is actually the data in your file. So like this side is your white side, this is your white point, this is your black point, and everything in between. So you've got blacks, shadows, midtones, highlights, and true white. Your image may or may not have true white in it, depending on how it's been photographed and shot. If it's a black t-shirt on a black background, your histogram here, which is what this kind of sound wave is called, is going to look totally different than this one is, since this one actually has whites. So you can kind of use this to read your image. This little spike here on the right is probably our white plexiglass here, the brightest part of our image. So we want to brighten up these products. And in order to use the curves here, the curves adjustment, we're going to add a point in the midtones, since we want to kind of brighten that area up. And we're going to click and drag that upwards. And then it kind of brightened up our shadows and washed out our products. So in order to keep the shadows nice and strong and keep the contrast there, I'm going to add another point down here in the shadows area. And I'm just going to drag that slightly back down so that it's right on that original diagonal line where we started. And if I undo and go forward again, back and forth, you can kind of see that that brought our shadows back down, kept them nice and strong. And if yours looks a little bright to you on your monitor, you can also adjust your highlights. Mine looks a little bit bright here. So I'm going to do the same thing I did in the shadows up here in the highlights, and just add a point and then drag that back down to where it started with, and that should help tone down some of those brighter areas. So let's keep our file nice and tidy. So let's throw these edits into a group. So if you click on one or the other and then hold shift and then click on the other one, it'll select both of your layers. If you had 20 layers in between those two, it would select all of the ones in between as well. And then to add a group, you can click on this folder down here, or you can hit Command G, and that would be Control G on a PC. So I'm just going to hit Command G here on my Mac, throws those into a group. I'm going to rename that group to Edits, and then I can expand, collapse, whatever I want to do with that group. If I want to keep my file looking, nice and tidy, especially when you end up with 15, 20 layers, it's really helpful to organize these and be able to really focus on where you want to be by hiding all the stuff that you don't want to be seeing, aren't going to be working on. And we can go back in time and kind of turn on and off our edits, see what it looked like before and after. And then our last step, let's come back in here and click on that mask we made on the Brighten products. And let's refine that like we talked about. None of the selection tools are ever that great, so you always want to refine. And if you want to see what your mask looks like, if you hit the backslash key, it'll give you this view. It kind of overlays a red layer over it. Just kind of shows you, helps you see exactly what the edges of your mask look like or how accurate you are. So I'm going to hit backspace to get out of that view, and then let's go up to Select and Select and Mask. And all I really want to do in this menu, this looks pretty good, and it's not going to be super critical since it's going to be pretty small on our website mockup. I'm just going to feather this a little bit and smooth it just a little bit, and I think that'll work just fine. So I'm going to hit OK, Right now I'm at 21 smooth, feather of 2 pixels. Yours might be slightly different, just depending on what your selection ended up looking like. And then you've also got these brush tools up here. So the same as with the selection, if you hold Shift or Option or Alt, that's going to add or subtract. So if I hold Option or Alt on a PC, I can start to remove from that. You can see it's taking a second. And vice versa. If I did it with Shift, it would start to add to my mask. Then there's these other ones. This selection one at the very top is very similar to selecting like we did before in order to create the mask. It's going to try and expand out, find your edges. Then the one below is the Refine tool. Mine went a little crazy here. Let me undo. There we go. This one's your Refine tool. You can try using this to brush over the edges of your item, and in theory it'll try and refine and catch those edges. I would try that one out, maybe open a photograph of somebody with hair where there's parts where you can see through it over the background, maybe find somebody with hair like that over a simple background, and then come in and try and brush over their hair and kind of see how that tool works. So once again, I'm pretty happy with how this looks. I'm going to hit OK, exit out. I'm going to collapse that group, and then I'm going to save this. So you can either go File, Save As, or Save in this case, or you can hit Command S on a Mac or Control S on a PC, and you'll get a pop-up to save. I'm just going to save this right back into the same folder with my original JPEG file, and it should default to a Photoshop document. As you can see down here, since we have layers, we want to save it as a Photoshop document so that we keep those layers and we can always adjust those later. So just hit save, and you can see your saving progress building up down here, and it's done. And you can either click the X up here on your document or hit Command W, Control W on a PC, and that'll close out your file. So let's move on to our second image. I'm going to come back to Bridge, click on the new Photoshop document we just made, and I'm going to hit Command 8, that would be Control 8 on Windows, to label that green. I'm just going to label all my Photoshop documents green just for quick navigating. So we're going to move on to our dark brown pottery here. So let's open that one either by double clicking or clicking it and then hitting enter on your keyboard. And as you can see with this one, if you zoom in, this pot must have brushed against another one or not been packaged very well in shipping. It needs a little love here to get rid of all these spots. So just to demonstrate here, let's go to our spot healing brush, and this is one of the tools we covered in Photoshop 1. It's super handy for something like this spot over here. It's going to fix that spot really easily. It's not going to be that handy for this, not only because it's going to take forever for you to get rid of all these, but since when I paint right here, it's surrounded by more and more spots, it almost views that as a texture. Photoshop, doesn't have the reason of a human being to be able to say, oh, this is what I want to keep, this is what I want to get rid of. So it just kind of views these repetitive spots spaced relatively evenly as a texture or a pattern, like if it was a print on a dress or something, and often will fill in your spots with more spots, since it's kind of surrounded by more and more spots. So for this, we're going to actually use a different approach. So I'm going to delete that layer one I used to demonstrate. And I'm going to duplicate my background here. You can right click and choose duplicate. And you can name it whatever you want. I'm just going to call it Scratches Fix. And then I'm going to come up here and add a filter. So come up to the very top and go Filter, Noise, and we're going to use a Dust and Scratches filter. And so yours will probably start out at maybe 1 and 0, and you won't see any change. The radius is essentially how big of a spot of dust or scratch or scuff do you want removed. So as you can see, if I go from 1 to 3, you don't really see much of a difference. If I go 3 to 5, it gets rid of a little bit more. If I keep on going up to say 10, it almost gets rid of it all. If I jump up to maybe 12, it gets rid of, enough that I'm happy with it. The problem with that is it obviously removed all of our texture. It doesn't look natural, obviously. It blurred out all the top of our ceramic pictures there. So we want to play with the threshold here. And this is just going to essentially, in this case, bring back detail. And you can start to slide that up, and it starts to bring back more and more detail. And I'm going to jump up to maybe 33, and we'll see how that looks. Let's go with 35. And you can kind of see there's a preview button here in that menu. You can turn on and off and see what it looked like before and after. So it really quickly got rid of all of those white spots and scratches. And kept all of the texture of the ceramic pot. We don't want to take out all the character of these items. The only problem is if you look up top, at the top of your pictures, they're still going to be blurred. It's removing detail. Doesn't look very good. So in this case, once again, we're going to create a mask so that we tell Photoshop where we want this effect to take place and where we don't want it to take place. So hit OK on that. That looks great. Let's add a mask to this. So come down here. We're still on our scratches fix layer. You can click on mask to add a mask. It starts out as white, which means it's still going to affect the entire image. If you hold down Option or Alt on a PC while you click that mask, it's going to do the opposite and start with black, which is kind of what we want in this part since we want to tell it where we want it to go, and you can't really tell where you want it to go when you can't see what it looked like before. Your other option is if you add a mask and it's white, if you hit Command-I, which would be Control-I on PC, that'll just invert. The I is for invert, so Control-I. It's going to just flip your mask back and forth. So use one of those options. Get yourself to a black, clean mask. And then let's come over and do the brush tool. You can hit the B key or come over here to the brush tool and click that. And you want a big soft brush, so you can double check that your hardness is all the way down. Mine's at 250, but once again, just like zooming in or out, or sorry, not zooming in or out. What did we use the bracket keys for? You can use the bracket keys, the same two keys that are to the right of the P key, for making your brush larger or smaller. And you'll want to make sure that you've got white selected. So if you don't have white selected, you can either click on the tiny icon right up above there, or you can hit the D key, and that'll restore D for defaults. And you should have white showing there. And if you start brushing over this, make sure you're selected onto your black mask icon there. Just start to paint in where you want this effect to take place. And you can come over here and get rid of these white spots. Come over here. And you can see we can quickly tell Photoshop that we only want to get rid of spots and have this effect take place in this area. If we came up here and brushed, obviously that's not where we wanted it. It's going to start blurring and showing that effect where we didn't want it. Once again, if you happen to go too far, let's just say, oops, I didn't mean to put my effect up over here. If you just switch over to black instead of white, and you can swap those color swatches just by hitting X to go back and forth. If I switch to black, I can just paint right back over that, and you'll see my mask updates as well to show that I just removed those areas. So that's all we're really going to do on this file. Let's save and close that. So you can hit Control or Command S to save. It should once again default to Photoshop, be in that same folder. Just going to hit save, and then you can either hit your X up here or hit Control or Command W to close. Then let's go back to Bridge and let's open up our last product here, which is our white bowl. And for this one, if you go back to Bridge just for a second, if I look at all of these side by side, the top two are pretty consistent, as far as tone, the way they were photographed, color. But our white bull is really blue, the background's too light, it's really going to stand out on the page and look inconsistent and unprofessional compared to the other two. So that's kind of what we want to fix with this file. So the first thing we want to do is try and get rid of that blue color. And there's a ton of different ways to affect color in Photoshop. As with anything you need to accomplish, there's at least 5 to 10 ways to do it. So let's look at a couple different ones. Let's go down and add an adjustment layer. So the first, most basic one is color balance. And with that, you get a bunch of sliders. So if I slide more towards yellow, you can see it brings yellow into my image. If I slide more towards blue, it brings in blue. Pretty simple there. And you can also get a little bit more refined by telling it that you want to focus on the shadows, the highlights, or the midtones. So let's just say our highlights were too blue. You could add yellow and it's going to affect the highlights more. We don't want to use color balance in this case, so click on your color balance layer and you can just hit the delete key. Or you can, let's see, you can drag it down here to the trash as well. So our next option is, let's see, let's go ahead and do curves. You can actually use curves in the very same way. Rather than adjusting brightness like we did before, you can click this RGB drop down and actually break out your 3 color channels on their own. So if we go to red and I affect only the red channel, I can add red by bringing the midtones up, or subtract red by bringing them down. Same thing in the highlights or the shadows over here. Or I can make my own crazy curve that's, you know, cold in the shadows and warm in the highlights. So if you know exactly kind of what your image needs, that can also be helpful. You know, if you know you only need a little bit of yellow, that can be handy. Things like that, small changes. Your other option that I like to start with, since it's kind of automatic, is you've got an auto button up here, but within that auto button there's actually kind of a hidden menu. So if you hold Option or Alt, Alt for PC, and click on auto there, you'll get a little pop-up. And you can try and see what these first 3 options look like. You can see as I click through them, it's going to change my colors, and that third one looks pretty decent. The other option you can turn on and off with those 3 is this snap to neutral midtones. And you can check all of those again. And I actually think I like that snap neutral midtones turned on and this enhance per channel contrast, the second option here, the best. I think that really neutralized our blue color, and I think that looks pretty good. So I'm going to go with that. You can either undo and follow along with me or keep that change and just watch here. One other option you can do is use your gray eyedropper here. It's the center one. And if you click that, you can actually use it to sample various areas of your image and tell it kind of what is a neutral color, what's gray, what shouldn't have a whole lot of color to it. So depending on where you click, if I click the highlights, it's going to make it really warm because that probably has more blue in it. If I click the shadows that are going to naturally have different colors in it, it's going to change entirely. So that can also be really helpful if you've got some neutral areas, either black, white, or gray, in your image in order to sample from. And when you're doing that, you usually also want to adjust your sample size. You know, you don't want to be clicking a single pixel. You'll want to be using an average. You know, in this case, 30 pixels. It's going to take a reading, you know, 15 pixels out on each side, and then take an average of those, and that'll give you a better sampling. So I'm just going to undo that and go back to where we were. So we did enhance per channel contrast with the snap to neutral midtones on. Hit OK. And I think that got us to a lot better place with color. It's still a little bit funky, so I'm going to kind of cheat in this case since our image doesn't have a lot of color to begin with. You know, it's a white bowl, gray background, white plex. I'm going to add another adjustment layer down here. And I'm going to do hue saturation. And I'm just going to drag my saturation down about halfway. And that's going to remove even more of the color that's still kind of hanging out in some of those weird areas. On mine, at least on my monitor, I'm getting some weird kind of green in here, a little bit of magenta in the shadows, and that'll just help to neutralize that a little bit better. So once again, these are adjustment layers. This is our second building block that we're really focusing on in this class, and that just keeps those adjustments separate off of your background, so you can just turn those off, delete them, adjust them later on down the road if you decided you wanted crazy saturation, anything like that. The flexibility is still there. You can always have that option. So the next thing we need to do, we got rid of the blue color, is we need to darken down the background so that it matches these others. So let's go right here, and we're going to add another curves layer. And if it helps, you can rename these as well. So I'm just going to name our first one White Balance, since we were balancing out our colors. I'm going to rename the hue saturation to Desaturate. And then our top one is going to be Darken Background. You guys can name these whatever you want, whatever makes the most sense to you. So we can either darken our background first and then create our selection, and then change our mask so that we're only darkening the background rather than the whole image here. And I think that's what I'm going to do, because it's going to actually give my bowl a little bit more contrast and hopefully help my selection tool select a little bit better. So I'm going to go up to my quick selection again and just start brushing over this bowl here. And then once again, hold Shift to add, Option or Alt to subtract. So I'm going to get the back of my bowl here, and mine immediately jumped to selecting the whole thing. The quick selection brush is great. It kind of learns what you want as you go and refines what it's looking for. So if it does this to you and it selects the whole thing, don't say oh darn and deselect it and just keep trying and starting over. Definitely hold down Option or Alt and start to subtract, and it should get a little bit smarter each time and be able to get you hopefully closer to what you want. So I need to add a little bit there by holding Shift, and maybe a little bit right there where it missed, and I think that looks pretty good. That's a great starting place. So I've got my selection around my bowl and my plexiglass, and I've got a white mask here that's totally white, so that means this darkening effect is happening to the entire image. So I want to use this selection of the bowl and the plexiglass to tell this mask that I don't want to be darkening everything. I only want to be darkening the background. So I've got my selection. I'm clicked onto that mask. Right click here on your selection and choose Fill. And then we want to fill it with black, since that will affect our mask. And remember, the black areas of your mask will not be affected. So if yours says anything else, you can click the drop down, make sure it's to black, hit OK. And you can see it got rid of that effect. It's only affecting the background. But just like our last image, our mask isn't all that clean. Our selection tool, not perfect for that job, and that was kind of a tough edge for it to decipher and work with anyways. So we want to refine that mask, so make sure you're still clicked onto it. Come up here and go to Select, Selected Mask, just like before. And I think I'm going to leave my view in this red overlay. It just helps me see the background, or see my mask a little bit better. So in this case, I'm going to do the same kind of thing as before. Let's add a little bit of smooth. And then if we bring our feathering up, I don't want to come up too much, but just a little bit. Let's see. Let's go to maybe 4 or 5 pixels. I'm going to go with 4. And hit OK. And it didn't do a whole lot of difference, but it did kind of soften that edge. You can kind of see there. And so I'm just going to finish this off with a brush. I need to bring back this nice soft edge here that it had before that's kind of sharp now. So I'm going to click the B key, or you can come over here and click on your brush. And I'm on black because I want to remove areas of the mask there. And you can double check, make sure your hardness is all the way down and you've got a nice soft brush. And I'm just going to go back and forth on that edge a couple times. and that'll soften that edge right up, bring me back to what it looked like before. And then I think this side of my bowl looks great. It's nice and sharp, clean mask. This side could use a little bit of love. I'm just going to use a smaller brush so that it's got kind of a more clean edge to it. And remove some of those areas where the bowl is still getting darkened down. Maybe a bigger, softer brush in back, since the back of our bowl is kind of out of focus and is going to have a softer edge naturally. And I went a little bit too far there, so I'm going to switch to white and paint over that just a little bit more, just so that I don't have any of the background that's not getting darkened. So you guys can take your time. Feel free to pause the video if you need to get your mask to a better place, get your background darkened down. So when we started this, I just guessed, darkened it down to a point that I thought looked okay. So now I want to make sure that it actually is darkened down the right amount. So I'm going to come back to Bridge. And you could do this a ton of different ways. You could actually physically drag another file into your document and then, maybe move it so that you can see them, in the same document, and come right here, back to your curves layer, darken it down to where it looks right. The other thing you could do is just open that document and then go back and forth between the two. If you click on this one, the dark brown, and click and drag it out, it's going to separate and you can actually see them side by side. You'd also want to drag this white one out and you'd have them floating side by side that way. I think I'm just going to go back to Photoshop, drag my dark brown image in. It asks me to place it, and then so just hit enter to get through that, and then I'm just going to move it down. And the way I moved it down is I hit Command T. That would be Control T on PC. That's the same as going up here to edit and then free transform. You can see it shows you the shortcut right there, Command T or Control T on a PC. And then that just brings up this transform menu. I can move it around, I can resize it, I can do whatever I want with it. So I'm just going to bring it down so it's out of my way. Click back here to my darkening background layer, and I'm just going to adjust that down to where I think looks good. Maybe add a little bit more contrast here, do kind of a little bit of an S curve to match the other. And I think that looks pretty good. It's not exact, but I think it'll work for what we're doing. So I'm going to delete that dark brown layer. Just for consistency's sake and good practice, I'm going to select all my layers. So click the top one, hold shift, click the bottom one, throw those into a group, either with the folder button here or by doing Command G, Control G on a PC. I'm just going to rename that group to Edits again. And then once again, you can collapse, expand that group, turn it on and off, all that kind of stuff. So I'm happy with this. I'm going to save and close it. So Command or Control S. It'll pop up. Once again, it should default to Photoshop, should default to that same folder. I'm just going to hit save. Then either your X up here on your document or Command W or Control W on a PC to close that out. Jump back to Bridge, highlight that in green, keep my Photoshop documents highlighted in green just for clarity's sake. So I'm going to jump back out of folder. We're going to work on a different one, and to do that in Bridge, if you're using Bridge, right up here you kind of have your whole file path broken out. So I'm in the 3 products folder there. I want to click on Final Files there. If I wanted to jump out 2 folders, I could click on this one here. Yours probably looks a little different, but yours should say Final Files there. Click that, it'll take you right back out. So our next image we want to work with is our flat lay bowl. So let's go into that folder and let's open up this bowl on the pink background here. And you'll see this a lot, if you're working for companies, maybe this was photographed by a different photographer or at a different time. The pink obviously isn't very on brand. It doesn't match any of their kind of rustic gray neutral tones they had in the other images. So we want to fix that for them. And we're going to show you how to make this selection in 2 ways. It's pretty darn easy on the pink background just using the quick selection brush. The bowl has a nice sharp edge that stands out really well from the background. So it's not very difficult for Photoshop to make that selection. You could also use the magic wand tool here. And you've got, once again, like when we sampled colors in the curves layer, you've got, you can either do a point sample or you can do an average. A little bit of an average is always good. And then you've got this tolerance option here. So if I set my tolerance way low to like 5 and I click over here, you can see it's not very tolerant. Anything that is even slightly different from the pink area I clicked, it's not going to select. But if I undo that and bring my tolerance back up to say 30 or even say 50 and I click in that same spot again, it's going to be way more tolerant. You can see it selected way more. So you can kind of use that to tell Photoshop how picky you want it to be. And once again, it left this area of my selection out that I definitely want. So I just need to hold Shift in order to add to my selection and just keep on clicking to bring that in. If I find that that's frustrating, I don't really like how it's doing that and I have to keep clicking, I can switch over to a totally different selection tool like the quick selection brush, hold Shift again to add, and just start painting in my selection, and it should start finding that edge pretty easily. And just for interest's sake, I'll show you guys one more quick way to make this selection. It doesn't really make sense in this case, but it is super handy for, let's say you had an image of somebody outside in the fall leaves, and you've got, you know, a leaf over here, a leaf here, here, they're all over the ground, that kind of thing. And you need a way to select all those leaves because you want to make them more red and more fall colory. But you don't want to take the selection brush and try and select this one, then come over here, select this one, this. It would take you forever. So this is super handy for cases like that. You can actually go up here and do select and choose color range. And if you click over here in your image, it'll start to show white, which is what it has selected. The black is areas that are not selected, and you can hold Shift once again to add to your selection. And you can even click here in the window or here on your actual image. And you can kind of see how this would work if your, you know, your fall color, your orange leaves were scattered everywhere. It's going to make those jumps and only look for that orange color, and it would be able to pick them up really easily. And you wouldn't have to individually select every leaf or anything like that. So right now it was selecting the pink, did the same kind of a selection as the other tools. So I'm going to jump back here. I'm just going to use the magic wand to make the selection with a couple clicks, holding Shift to add so that I get everything right up to the edge of the bowl. And then I want to use that selection to create a mask, and I only want my mask to show the bowl. So when I add my mask layer here, or when I add my mask to this background layer here, it's the opposite of what we wanted. So all we have to do is hit Command I or Control I while we're on that mask, and it's going to invert it. And you can go back and forth as many times as you want. So we inverted it. It's on only our bowl. Once again with our selection tools, none of them are perfect, so it left us a little bit of a pink halo around our bowl. So we want to fix that. We want to go in and always refine our selections. So select, select and mask. And I think I want to see it on the layer so that I can really see that pink and make sure I'm getting rid of it. So I'm going to feather it just a little bit, maybe 1 or 2 pixels. And then I want to shift my edge. And I want to bring that probably all the way down. And I might even add a little bit of contrast back in. So I'm shifting that edge in and softening it slightly, and that just cuts off that little bit of pink that was showing there. That looks great to me, so I'm going to hit OK. And normally you wouldn't ever do anything to your original image layer, but with a mask you can always come in here and delete or disable it. It's not actually affecting that layer at all, so it makes sense to just use that layer rather than duplicating it and creating extra layers and data in your file that you don't need. So we're done with that for now. Let's save it. So Control S or Command S. It should default once again, Photoshop, same folder, same file. Hit save, and then you can hit Control or Command W to close out. And so we're going to do a quick little composite here and use a little trick in order to make it look more realistic. So you can open up either this sort of distressed concrete or the wood layers here. I'm going to go with the concrete, so I'm just going to double click that. Once that opens up, I'm going to go back to bridge, and I'm going to drag my bowl Photoshop document. I'll label that green real quick. I'm going to drag that right into that document. It's going to ask me to place it. I'm just going to hit enter. And so this layer looks a little bit different now. When we dragged it in that way, it made it a smart object. And we haven't talked about smart objects yet, but you can think of smart objects as kind of a Photoshop document within a Photoshop document. If I click into this, double click it, it takes me into the document we were just editing since I placed that document inside of this other document. I can edit it, make changes. If I wanted to, add a pink squiggle, if I save it and close it, it'll take me back out. There's my pink squiggle. That does not affect my original file out here at all. It's now the one I'm editing is living in here inside this other document. And the other great thing about smart objects is that they keep all of the original information for size and resolution. So just to demonstrate what I mean, I'm going to create a duplicate of that, and I'm going to rasterize it, which turns it back to a normal layer. It's no longer a smart object. And I'm just going to place those side by side so we can really see this here. And what I mean when it keeps all of the original resolution is it just gives you a lot of flexibility in editing. So let's just say you were making a flyer here for a restaurant, and today for some reason you decided that you only needed your images to be only needed them to be that big, pretty tiny, In fact, let's go even smaller. Let's go down to like 5% for those. They're really, really tiny. And then you come back the next day and you decide, oh darn, I don't need them that small. I need it pretty big. I need it to fill the entire flyer here. You can come back, drag them back up to their original size here, and if we confirm that, you can see our smart object still looks great, because when we shrunk it way down and hit enter to confirm shrinking it, it kept all of the original resolution, all of that data, all of that info. Our other one that we rasterized and turned into a normal image layer did not, so it got rid of all that data, and then we essentially just stretched it back out way too far in order to bring it back up to this size. So smart objects are great for that. The trade-off is that since it is holding on to so much data, when you save it as a Photoshop document, it's going to be a lot bigger of a document. And we'll look at that a little bit later as well, compare a few different files. So I'm just going to undo that change here, bring this over into here, and let's do this. So I'm just going to shrink my bowl back down a little bit. Let's go a little bit larger. And so we've got our bowl here. Our angles match. They're both overhead. The bowl looks like it's sitting there flat, but it doesn't quite look realistic because there's no shadow. You can tell that there's light coming from this side because we've got a little bit of shadow on the bowl there. And then this is our bright side of our bowl, so our light's coming from the upper right to the lower left. And so we want to bring in a shadow. So once again, there's a million and one ways to do things in Photoshop. You could make a curves layer, darken it down, hide that below your bowl layer, and then use like a brush to, create a shadow slowly, and maybe if you wanted a nice, soft, simple shadow, that would work for you. A lot of times what I would recommend is to use the natural shadow that's already there. If we go back and look at our bowl, it has a natural cast shadow that looks pretty good. Usually if you're hand brushing or hand creating a shadow, it's never going to look quite as good or natural as the original. That's not, once again, a 100% all the time rule, but definitely something that I've found over time. So in order to keep that shadow, we want to create a duplicate of this smart object because we're going to have one that's going to be our bowl, then one that we're going to go in, edit, and flip so that it's our shadow and our background. So if you right click on this, we want to do new smart object via copy. And then let's name them just for clarity. I'm going to name that copy to be bowl. And then the one underneath is going to be shadow. And our bowl looks great. Don't need to make any changes there. Our shadow we want to change to just show our shadow in our background. So double click on your layer icon there. It's going to open up. Click on your mask and hit Command I or Control I if you're on a PC in order to flip the mask. We're going to invert it. And then we want to save it and close it. And you can see that's not what we want. You know, it did what we want in that it's now only showing the shadow in the background, but that's not exactly looking any better than it was before. So we're going to add a new tool or a new option to our repertoire here. So every layer has a blend mode, which is right here. Right now these are set to normal, so they show up normal just like the images actually are. For this, we're going to actually change it to multiply, and that's going to darken down our background. You can see we brought in our shadow, but it also brought in all that pink color with it. So let's go back into our smart object there, and let's add either a black and white or a hue saturation layer and drag the saturation all the way down. And you can see that got rid of our pink color. So let's go back and look at it. If you save this and close it. So that's a step closer. We now no longer have pink. Our concrete or our wood doesn't look crazy, whichever background you used. We're getting our shadow, but it's also darkening everything else around it. And the reason for that is that if you go back in here and look at your background, this isn't white. So anything when you set your blend mode to multiply that isn't white is going to cause a darkening effect. So in this case, all we really need to do is make all of this white and keep our shadow a little bit darker, and it'll create that shadow effect. So in order to get that to white, let's add a curves layer, and we're going to brighten this up. So you can either do it by sight and just assume that, oh, that's about white, that looks good. The way I like to do it is if you hold Option or Alt if you're on a PC, and then click and hold on that white slider, your screen will turn to black. And if it's black, it means it's not pure white. And as we start to scroll to the left and get closer and closer, brighter and brighter to being pure white, you can start to see it actually turn to white there. And so if I come up to about right there, everything in my document is true white. It's not going to cause any darkening down effect. Back in our other document, only our shadow that's showing there in black is still off-white and is going to cause some darkening, which is what we want. We want to have a shadow there. So I'm going to leave it at that and let go. And I'm actually going to drag my midpoint down a little bit. You guys can do this too, just to darken that shadow up a little bit. So that looks great. I'm going to hit save and close that. And you can see in our original document, if we turn that layer on and off, it's not darkening anything down other than the actual shadow area. And I think this looks great. This is exactly what we wanted for this. We're done with this image. Quick, simple composite with a little bit of a trick there using our blending modes in order to keep that shadow. And that's actually a new feature in Photoshop, I just realized. Didn't used to do that, where if you hovered over them, it would give you a preview of what it's going to do. So if you guys want to explore blending modes more, open up two photos, throw them over the top of each other, and just start playing with them, and you'll see exactly how they interact with each other. So we're done with this document. We're going to save. Once again, should automatically choose Photoshop, be in the right place. You can just save and close there. And it's taken a minute because it's got two smart objects here. So while we're on the subject, I'm going to select both of these and rasterize them, which just means it gets rid of all that extra data. They're not smart objects anymore. I can't shrink them way down and stretch them back out and have it still look good. I'm going to save that out as a different file. And let's compare the two to see the size difference. Because remember, when it saves all that data inside of a smart object in your file, it's going to make it a lot bigger file. So our smart object file is 240 megabytes, and our non-smart object file is 130. So it's almost twice as big when you keep all those smart objects. So just something to keep in mind when you're working with smart objects. If you have a ton or your computer space is low, you might want to think twice about keeping and saving all of those. So I'm going to label that in green as well. And we're going to jump back out of our folder again. Remember, just click this Final Files up here in the upper part of your Adobe Bridge to go back out. And we're going to jump over and look at a couple raw images here. So raw is almost like a smart object that your camera creates. If you have a camera that was made recently, it's most likely that you could test this out and shoot in a raw format. Here are a couple examples that I shot purposely incorrectly so that we could actually look at the power of raw here. So this is the JPEGs that my camera created, and these are the raw files it created. And just like smart objects, in the raw format, your camera is capturing so much more data than just the JPEG it creates, which gives you a lot more flexibility and a lot more data to work with and information that we'll look at in a second. But once again, the trade-off there is that you get a massive file size. So my JPEG is 5 megabytes, my raw file is almost 50, so it's almost 10 times as large as just the JPEG. So once again, shooting in raw format is a great thing, gives you the most flexibility, but if you don't need it, don't shoot in raw because it's just going to fill up your computer real quick. So let's double click and open that raw file, and that is 8133.raf. If you double click that, it's going to open in this camera raw option, and this is something that we haven't seen yet. And as you can see, it's a dark pot. It's not usable. It looks terrible. But with raw, and when it captures all that data, if we start to bring the exposure slider up, you can see there's a lot more data than what we originally thought was there. And if we start to bring our shadows up, we can see even more in these dark areas. And we're really pushing the limits of our camera here and our sensor. You can start to see a lot of grain and noise. Our color is a little weird, a little magenta. But if it really came down to it and you had to, you could probably get away with a lot of editing, cleaning up color, and making this image actually work for somebody's website. But let's go back, and if I open my JPEG version of it that was shot and has way less data, my camera doesn't keep all that extra data that RAW has. But if I go back into the camera raw filter option, you can do this on any image, even if it's a JPEG. It will not add data or resolution or anything like a real RAW file. It just gives you those same sliders, the same options. If I come back in just for a perfect side-by-side test using these same sliders on my JPEG that has way less data, way less information, when I slide the exposure up, the blacks stay black. There's just no information in there. My camera just got nothing. It crushed all the blacks and they're pure black. There's not even an edge here like we had on our other one. And you also see some banding. You get these weird kind of teal, bluish, magenta kind of streaks and banding in your image that it just doesn't really hold up so good. It doesn't have enough information to be pushed as far as we're trying to push it here. So we're not actually going to do anything with those two images. That's just to kind of demonstrate what RAW is capable of. We are going to use these two though. So open up 8163.raf. If you just double click that or hit enter on it, open it up. Once again, it captures way more data in RAW. My white balance on my camera was way off. It looks so blue. It looks terrible. But if I come up here to my white balance and even just pick auto, it gets us way closer to something that looks normal. Totally usable as it is. You could continue to, toggle your color if you wanted it a little more yellow, anything like that. But I think what it did there looks perfectly usable. Super easy to just hit open image down here, and it'll open that file up for you to work with. Once again, if I open up the JPEG version that has way less data to work with, let's see here, it's taking a second. There it is. And if I go back to my camera raw filter and I try the same thing on the JPEG that has way less information to work with, and I try to white balance auto, It's close, but it's not as good. You know, our shadows are magenta. Everything is still kind of blue. So if I decide, oh, I want to get rid of the blue, let's make it more yellow. But I still have the magenta shadows, and then I try and add some green to get rid of those. It's just kind of all out of whack. So once again, raw is great, but it does make for huge files, so you can kind of keep that in mind when you're deciding if you want to shoot and work with raw or not. So let's go back to our original spoon that we made the color a lot better in raw. And we're going to make a couple quick fixes to this, and then we're going to essentially do the same thing we did before and make a little quick composite just to kind of review. So the first thing we want to do is let's get rid of the hole in the handle here, and then we're also going to get rid of this little 1 tablespoon imprint in the actual spoon itself, because we're going to actually make this look a lot bigger than 1 tablespoon size in our composite, so we don't want that to be showing. So once again, using our building blocks we've been talking about, let's add a new layer so that our fixes that we're going to make over the hole and over that stamp are not on the original. For the stamp here, I'm going to use the spot healing brush tool. That's the one that looks like a band-aid here. And make sure that your sample all layers is turned on. And you can just start brushing over those items and it should start to go away. And that cleans up pretty darn easily here. Pretty easy fix. You can turn that on and off. Make sure it looks good. And then down here for the hole, let's look at a couple different tools. So the tools that rely on selection, like a patch, are going to be tough because you're going to have to really squeeze your way in between the edges there and come down. And let's just see how it works. It actually does a really good job if you're able to squeeze through there. Let's take another look again. Let's just say we cut into it slightly right there. So I missed a little bit right there. And let's patch it again and see what happens. You can see it kind of plays off that and adds like a shadow or like a divot there. So really making sure you're getting everything in your selection is important. Definitely for this, you don't want to select right to the edge of it. You definitely want to be outside of it a little bit and give it a little bit of a wide berth for the best option there. Another great option for fixing that would be the clone stamp, which is this kind of stampy looking guy, 2 down from the patch tool. And once again, you'll want to make sure current and below or all layers is checked. And with the clone stamp, you have to sample an area. So if you hold Option on Mac or Alt on a PC and hover, you kind of get these crosshairs. And I want to bring this essentially this color, this pattern, and put it over here, over the top of it to hide the hole. So I'm going to come up here and hold Option or Alt and click once. So I've sampled, and as I come down and hover over this, it's going to give me a preview now of what it's going to paint in that area. And I'm just going to start painting over and over. And if I go far enough down, it'll actually redraw my hole that I had originally, because you can see just up to the right of where I'm painting, you see the plus. It's moving closer and closer towards the hole in the handle, and it'll eventually get to it and start to draw it in. So I think I'm going to go back and use the patch tool again. I think that worked better. Make sure I give the hole in the handle enough space. Come up here, patch. It's a little bit weird down here. I'm just going to patch that again. And I think that'll work just fine for this. So we're going to use a different kind of selection tool, because we're going to cut out this spoon and we're going to end up moving it and putting it on the table in this image here. So we're going to actually use the pen tool for this, and it's right above the T for text tool. It kind of looks like an old fountain pen. And with this tool, you get a, it actually gives you a summary here. Yours may or may not pop up like this. This creates a vector selection, which you could essentially make. It makes a path, which you can turn into a selection, and that path is a vector. And the vector you can make as large or as small as you want without losing any resolution or sharpness. Your selection or your path isn't going to become pixelated if you make it 10 times as large in size. And it's also super handy for stuff like this where we really want to get an exact selection on the edge. And the easiest way to use this tool is you'll add a point by clicking on the very edge of your spoon, and you want to go with the curve. So we're going to click maybe right up here where it starts to curve again over to the right, and it'll draw a straight line. Then we'll add a point in the middle, and then if you hold down Command on Mac or Control, I believe, on Windows, so if you hold that down and then click on your point, you can drag it anywhere you want, and it starts to create the curve that goes with the spoon. And you can see here on mine's a little too high here and a little too low here. So with that point we just added, you get these two handles. So if you hold down Control or Command and click on those, you can also affect your curve that way too. You can drag them out, you can drag them up and down. So I just need to drag mine up a little bit on this side, down a little bit on the other, and it looks like that's not quite going to work, so I'm actually just going to add another point here and bring it up, another point there and bring it down. In theory, the more points you have, the less smooth your curve is going to be. So you don't want to use this tool like this, going all the way around your item. You definitely want to make a jump, add a point, and then create that perfectly smooth curve in between the two and adjust it with those handles as needed. That'll give you a nice, perfectly smooth curve. So I'm going to jump over to here, add a point, hold Command or Control to drag it outwards, match my curve with the spoon. Then I'm going to do a big jump here because this is kind of one long smooth curve on the bottom. Click over to maybe there, drag this down, use my handles to pull that out, and that looks pretty good there at the bottom. Then we've kind of got another inward curve here, so I'm going to click there, add a point, drag it up. The handle should be pretty straight. It looks like it's not perfectly straight though, so I'm going to add another point, drag this down to the edge, and then that created a little gap here, so I'm going to add a point, drag this up. I'm going to click over to the other side of my handle here, add a point, drag it down. Use those handles to create the curved end of the spoon there. And then I'm going to close my path here by clicking on my first point. It must have lost this point. So I just click the first and then click back to this one to connect it. If yours ever gets lost in itself, you can click the last point you had. It'll latch onto that, and then you can keep drawing. And it's a little bit off for me, so I'm just going to add a point, bring it up, and maybe bring this down a tiny bit right there. And you can see this looks a little bit different from a selection, and if you click over here to your paths panel, you can see your work path. You can click off it, on it, and it'll show it. I'm going to rename this to spoon. And if I click that path and I go back to my layers, I can right click on it and choose make selection, and that's just going to turn our path into a selection. If I want to feather it to get a little bit softer of an edge, I can. So maybe I'll just feather it by 2 pixels, hit OK. It's going to create that selection. And I'm going to go to my background layer, and I'm going to add that selection as a mask to that layer. So if I just click the mask icon down here, it's going to add that as a mask with using that selection we made to the spoon, which is perfect. If you see any weirdness sticking outside over here, since our hole was so close to the edge of the handle, you might have created some fixes that go beyond the edge of the actual spoon up here in your layer 1. If that's the case, you can hold Option or Alt, click onto this mask, drag it up and let go, and it'll add the same mask to your fixes. So like I say, if you had something crazy that was going beyond the edge of the spoon and you wanted to keep all that within the spoon, hold Option or Alt, click this mask, it'll duplicate the mask to that layer, cut off any of those fixes that are sticking out too far. So I'm going to do that real quick. Perfect. I'm just going to save this as a Photoshop document. So Command or Control S and save. Then Command or Control W to close, or you can click the little X up here. We're going to go back to Bridge, and we want to add that spoon to our table interior. So I'm going to open the table. Then you can either drag this your clipped out spoon straight into the document, or you can go File, Place Embedded, and then find your file. It's this one, Place, and it'll do the exact same thing. It's placing it as a smart object, so it lets you transform it first if you want. It doesn't matter if you do that or if you hit Enter just to get it in there, and then you can always transform it again later. So I am going to transform my spoon so that I can get it to be the right scale compared to our cup and table, chair, all that stuff. So hit Command T or Control T while you have your spoon layer selected. And you can drag your corners in or out in order to resize your spoon. You can make it look about right. And yours may or may not let you, it may or may not lock your aspect ratio. So it might keep it totally locked perfect, or it might let you go all kinds of crazy and warp it like that or distort it. Just kind of depends on what preferences you have set or what version of Photoshop you're using as the default. If you click this little link here, that's going to lock your width and height so that it keeps the same ratio. And if you use one of these 4 corner points to drag in or out, it's going to always keep it to be the right aspect ratio so that you can't distort it, make it look unnatural. So get it to about the right size, and then you can also click inside of that transform, drag it around, put it somewhere next to the cup. And when you're to that point, we're going to do the same trick we did before on our bowl, our overhead photograph of the bowl that we put on concrete or wood. And we're just going to steal that shadow we had in the other, in our original photograph of the spoon. So we want to create a duplicate of our spoon layer so that we can turn that one into a shadow. So right click on that one, and we want to create a new smart object via copy. And I'm going to name that top one to spoon and the bottom one to shadow. And if I double click to go into my shadow smart object, I can get rid of my fixes, because when I come down here and go to my spoon, I want it to be the background. I don't want to see the spoon, I want to see the background. So I can hit Control or Command I after selecting that mask, and it's going to invert it. And like I say, you don't need your fixes anymore, so you can click that and either hit the delete key or drag it down here to the trash icon. Get rid of that. And once again, just to demonstrate, you can do all your fixes that we will do right here, right now, and get them done, but just to kind of demonstrate it and why we're doing it step by step, I'm going to save and close out. And then there's our background, and we're going to come and change our blend mode to multiply so that we're darkening it down, we're creating that shadow. Once again, it's not a white background, so anything that's not white is going to create a darkening effect. And we've kind of got some blue color coming in. So I'm going to go back into that smart object. And once again, I want to remove all the color from it. I don't want any color, I just want darkening down from the shadow. So I'm going to add a hue saturation adjustment layer. Drag the saturation all the way down to a -100. And then we can add our curves layer that we'll use to brighten up that background and get rid of all the info around the shadow so that all we have that's going to be darkening things down is the shadow. So remember, to see that visually, if you hold Option or Alt on a PC, click that white paddle there, drag it up, you can start to see it turn white. So our problem with this image is that by the time we get everything to white around it, you've got almost no shadow left at all. There's just a tiny bit, and that's going to look funny. So we want to stop somewhere around there where you still have a nice shadow, but you've got plenty of white around your spoon. and we just want to get rid of all this stuff. So we're going to combine a couple of our building blocks. So there's a ton of ways you could do this. You could come to your mask layer, use a brush, use the brush tool set to black so that you're removing from the mask, and you could come in and paint all this out, get rid of it all. It's going to take you a second, and you're never quite sure if you're actually getting rid of it all or not. So in this case, I would just grab one of the lasso tools, maybe the original lasso right here. Just draw a quick selection around what you want to keep, that shadow. And then I want to inverse my selection. So you can go select, inverse, or use the shortcut it shows you there, Command-Shift-I or Control-Shift-I on a PC. Click inverse. It's going to flip our selection, so now it's all the background is selected. Then I want to fill those parts that we've selected of my mask with black so that they don't show up at all. We want to get rid of it all so you can't see it. So I'm going to right click, fill, and make sure my contents are black. I'm going to fill it with black, hit OK, and that'll get rid of all of that stuff that we didn't want to see. I'm going to hit, you can either do select, deselect, or Command or Control D to deselect. And if we save and close, it should look how we want it to, with only the shadow showing up and only the shadow darkening down our table there. And that's what we've got. And it looks great. You could continue to go in and edit these things if you wanted to brighten your spoon, darken your spoon so it looked a little more natural, anything like that. But I think this looks pretty good. We've got our spoon, we've got our shadow set to multiply so that it's darkening down that table. And it's a nice quick little composite. So I'm going to save this, Command or Control S, save it as a Photoshop document, and then Command or Control W to close out. And that might take a second since I've got a couple smart objects there. So if I go back to Bridge, I'm just going to highlight that in green so that I can come back, quickly grab that. So I'm going to go back out to my final files here in Bridge by clicking up here on Final Files. And the last thing to do is to put this all together into our website format. And to do that, we're going to use a new type of document called an artboard, and then we're going to add all of our assets together. So if you go back to Photoshop and you click Create New, if yours does not have the button right here, if you just go File and then New, it's the very first option. Mine's grayed out because I already have it up here. You've got all sorts of different options here. If you click over to Web, you've got, once again, all kinds of options. You can scroll up and down, see what they have. I'm going to click here and see all presets. And I'm going to go with an iMac 27. That just means an iMac 27-inch desktop type screen. So I'm going to design the desktop version of this site first. And yours should automatically have artboards clicked if you've clicked on a web over here. Just double check that that is checked. iMac 27, you can hit Create and it'll pop up. And artboards look slightly different at first. You've got the little artboard text here, and then you've got this artboard 1 over here in your layers. Artboards are great for laying out multiple documents sort of in the same canvas, if that makes sense. If you click on this artboard 1, and you've got the artboard tool up here at the very top, if you click that, you get these pluses. So let's just say you were doing a flyer that was front and back, one sheet of paper front and back printed. You can click this plus, and you'd be able to design your front and your back side by side right there. You could add as many documents as you want here, going around and around. If you had, you know, a four sheets folded and stapled kind of thing, you could design them all together. So I'm just going to delete those, go back to where I started. We're going to design it here as a desktop version. Then we'll go back, create a duplicate, a new artboard, and do our mobile version. So if you click on your layer 1 here, let's start adding our assets. And actually, before we do that, we're going to start with our header. So let's create a group. So if you click on the folder down here or hit Command or Control G, it's going to create a group, and let's just call it header or banner, whatever you want to call it. That's just going to kind of be our big panoramic image at the top of our website. And let's just start and create a mask for that. So if I click anywhere off the canvas up here in the upper left, let me get a little bigger so you can see, anywhere up here, click, hold, and drag over. And I'll just make that that's going to be the size of my header. And I can always adjust it later. So I've got my selection. I want to tell Photoshop that's where I want my header to be. So I'm going to click the mask icon. It's going to add a mask to that group. So any layers or files I drop inside of that group are only going to show up inside of that mask area that we just defined. So I'm going to zoom out a click back to my layer 1. And I'm just going to start adding the things we did. So let's go to our raw images folder. And I'm going to use the table with the spoon as our header. And if you ever in Bridge need to see things bigger, you've got this little slider down here. You can zoom in or out there. So I'm just going to drag that in, or you can come up here and go File, Place Embedded, and it'll do the exact same thing. I'm just going to hit Enter to start with. And I'm going to drag this up so that it's inside of my header group. And you can see that it just went inside of that mask, so that's why half of it disappeared, because it's going based off of that mask right there that we just created. And I want this to fill the entire header side to side. So I'm going to click on that table interior image, click Command T or Control T, and you get these options. And remember what happened last time with yours, whatever your settings were, whether you had to hold Shift or not in order for your image not to get all stretched. You want to make sure it keeps those dimensions even whenever you adjust your size using one of those 4 corners. You may have to click on this link, just a reminder there. So I'm just going to drag this so it fills the space side to side. Then I'm going to drag it down to right about where I want it. That shows off the spoon and our mug well. I'm going to hit Enter to confirm that. Then let's go back to Bridge, and I'm going to drag in some of the site assets. So I'm going to go back to Final Files, Site Assets, and for our header, I'm going to want the logo, and I'm also going to want the header buttons. So I'm going to click both of those, drag those in. It's going to have me resize one, and then the other. I'm just going to hit Enter, and then I'll resize them on my own. So I'm just going to hit Command T, Control T on PC, and resize this on down. And I'm going to put my logo in the upper left. At this point in the demo, if you want to follow along exactly, great. If you want to design your site however you want, go right ahead. I'm going to do the same thing with my header buttons and resize those down a bit and just put those in the upper right. And then we're going to play with our logo a little bit. We don't want it to be this solid block. It just kind of looks stark. So we're going to play with our blend modes again. Remember our blend modes right here? And you can kind of scroll through them and see what it looks like. And I'm actually on the wrong layer, so make sure you're on the right layer, which is our SNS logo. And if I scroll down and hover on multiply, that looks better. We're getting just the black outline instead of our white and black like we had before. Now take a look at it on screen. It shows just the white. It's kind of the opposite of multiply. So anything light will brighten up your image rather than on multiply, where anything that's not white will darken down your image. And I like that, but I think I want to change the logo even more. So I'm going to hit Command I or Control I on this item, on this layer, on this smart object, and that's going to invert it. You can see it added a smart filter since this is a smart object. It just inverted it. So the black became white, the white became black, and I think that looks a lot better. It's just the text, just the box, makes for a nice logo up there when you set your blend mode to screen. If we go back to multiply, you can see it kind of flipped it. So I'm just going to stick with screen. So I'm happy with my header there. I'm going to collapse my header group, And I'm going to start adding some of our products here. So we're going to do featured products next. So drag your featured products text over, and you can resize that and center it up, put it off to the side wherever you guys want it. Just going to put mine right in the center. Then I'm going to come back out to my final files, and we're going to add our 3 products. So you should have your 3 Photoshop documents that we edited. You can grab all 3 of those and drag them in. And I'm just going to hit enter, enter, and enter on all of them. And then I'm going to resize them all at once. And that way that will keep them all the exact same size, since they were all the same size to begin with. Before I do that, I'm going to grab all of these layers by holding Shift and clicking down. And I'm going to hit Command G, or I can hit the little folder icon down here. Throws those into a group. I'm just going to call that one Featured Products. I'm going to expand the group so I can see those layers, and I'm going to select all of those 3 product images, and then Command T or Control T to transform. And I'm just going to shrink them down to something like that. And they're all over the top of each other right now, so I need to Command T in order to move them around and resize them so that I can see them all. And it looks like I did not make them small enough, so I'm just going to kind of space them out evenly, select them all again, and then transform one more time. And as you're transforming this time, try holding down Option or Alt, and it's actually going to resize around what's called the anchor point. You can use your anchor point and click and put it anywhere on your document, and it's going to resize around that point. It can really help in resizing towards the center rather than doing this and then having to bring them all back up to wherever you wanted them, that kind of thing. Just helps you to resize around that anchor point, makes it a little bit faster. So I'm going to center those up, and as you can see, your document might be running out of space as well. If I click on my artboard 1 here in my layers panel, I'm actually going to rename that while I'm right here. I'm just going to name that to desktop, since this is our desktop website. And if I come up here to the move tool, the very top tool, that's where our artboard tool is hidden. It's hidden underneath that. So if I go to my artboard tool right there, I don't want to click the pluses, but I get these kind of transform like boxes around it. I'm just going to click and hold on the bottom one, drag this down, and this is just going to kind of simulate a scrolling website. So that looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and add in more items. So I'm done with featured products for now. I'm going to go back to Adobe Bridge. I'm going to add in my bowl. So make sure you grab your composite that has the background, and you can drop that in. And I'm going to go ahead and resize mine. Just start with that for now. And I'm going to come back out, and I'm going to add my Lorem Ipsum Bob Ross. If you've never seen Lorem Ipsum before, it's just kind of a random generated text to simulate text on a website. It's just gibberish. This is a Bob Ross themed one. For some reason it came out kind of being dark for being Bob Ross. You wouldn't expect that. I'm just going to make that a little bit larger here. Move that over to the side. And I actually think that that looks great side by side. Maybe I want to move this image so that it lines up right on the left side with my featured products there, and it'll kind of snap and give me that pink line. And that looks good. And I'll move my Lorem Ipsum to do the same. Maybe center it up there. And I think that looks pretty good for my website preview. If you guys want to continue to mess with it, get it exactly how you want, feel free. So now we're going to create a mobile version of this website. So to do that, we essentially want to create a duplicate of this exact artboard, since our mobile site will have all of the same features, same images as our desktop site. It's just going to be a different layout. You can right click, and actually before we do that, let's continue to be diligent about keeping our layers clean. So I'm going to select my little composite, my bowl there, and my Bob Ross Lorem Ipsum. Throw those into a group. And I'm just going to rename that to flat bowl. So once you got everything nice and clean, you've kind of got all your different sections separated and everything. If you click on your desktop artboard there in your layers panel, if you right click on it and choose duplicate artboard, it'll pop up and let you name it. So why don't we rename it to mobile and hit OK. You can see it created an exact duplicate of that. That's great, but it's not quite what we want since this is going to be a mobile version of the site. If you have your mobile one selected here in your layers panel, if you come up here to set artboard to preset, it's probably set to custom right now. You can pick any one of these items. So I'm just going to pick the first one here, an iPhone as a general mobile outline. And as you can see, this simulates more of the vertical aspect ratio of a phone screen. And once again, if I know I'm going to need more background to fit all my items in and simulate kind of a scrolling web page on someone's phone, I'm just going to drag that out. And then since we've got everything nice and organized here, it's really easy to come in and adjust everything. So if I want to adjust my table so that it fits here, that's no problem. I can adjust my logo if I need that to be smaller. That's no problem either. My buttons. You can see how easy it is to do all this when you keep your layers named correctly. If yours does like mine does and gets kind of crazy when you're trying to resize, if you hide your desktop version of your site, since we're not working on it right now, that should help. So for some reason it moved my buttons out of that group. I just moved them back, and now it should, yeah, it's not going crazy anymore. So if yours goes crazy like mine does, just hide your desktop version and that should help. Get my logo up there a little bit, and that looks pretty good. If you don't like how square this might end up looking, your mask for your header there, you can totally either click on the mask down here and delete it and redraw it by hand. You can also unlink the mask from that group. That means it's not going to resize everything that's inside of that group when you do it. And if you click on the mask when it's unlinked and just hit Command or Control T, you can resize it to whatever size you want. Change the aspect ratio, all that kind of stuff. So let's just say we still want it to be kind of panoramic, and that looks pretty good. You can relink your mask then right here just by clicking in that blank space between your mask and your group. That'll relink it. And maybe I'll just adjust my table a little bit there. Maybe we'll make it a little bit smaller so that it doesn't overlap our logo. Alright, and then on and on, you can come in here, adjust your featured products. So maybe the featured products text hangs out on its own still, and our 3 products maybe go side to side. If you decide that's taking up too much space, once again you can draw and add a mask. So I just grabbed the rectangular marquee tool here, drew what I want to keep of this document or this layer of the white bowl. I'm on the white bowl layer. I can just click to add a mask. It's going to add that mask. I could continue to draw custom masks for all 3 of those, or once again I can copy this mask, exact same size and everything, down to these other items just by holding Option or Alt and clicking and dragging that mask down. Note that it can get a little weird since my pictures were down and off to the side and weren't exactly where my white bowl is, up above and to the right a little bit. Once again, you can just unlink that mask, click on the layer. So let's actually hide the gray and go and unlink our dark brown. I can Command T and adjust my dark brown product to fill the space there. And make sure that I totally fill that mask. And you can do the same thing with your gray and your white. And I'm actually going to redraw my mask because I don't want this part that hangs out off to the side. So I'm just going to take that and right click, fill. Once again, black makes it so that that area doesn't show up. Fill it with black, it'll get rid of it. And I'm going to use that mask on all three of those layers. And so maybe now I've got my three products, and those are going to sit one above another. I'm going to hide my flat bowl so that I don't have to look at it right now. And our gray is for some reason hanging out way over here. If you can't find one of your layers and see it, just click it over here in your layers panel and hit Command or Control T, and it'll throw that transform box around it, and you can grab it and bring it over. And I gotta copy that mask because it moved it like crazy over to the side. And let's find out, where's our gray? It must be up here. And it gets a little funky copying these masks around. If I hide my white, I should be able to see my gray. And I can resize it to fill that mask. And once again, I don't want this as part of my mask, so I'm just going to get rid of that. And I'm not on the mask, so I need to click to the mask in order to be able to right click and fill it with black. And then I'm just going to bring that gray layer down so it's below the rest. And then my pictures are kind of cut off here, so I'm going to unlink the mask so that I don't move the mask, I only move the layer. And I'm just going to move those up so I can see the bottom of them. Perfect. I can relink that as well if I want. And then the last thing to mess with is our bowl. So let's grab our bowl and let's resize that. And you can make that whatever size you want and arrange your Bob Ross text however you want. For some reason that one's still kind of going crazy. Let's see. For some reason it being a smart object was making it go a little crazy, so I just right clicked, rasterized it, brought it down since this is just for demonstration. I'm going to move this out from under it. And then you can see the white background of our Bob Ross text is affecting this. So there's two ways I could fix that. I could take the Bob Ross layer and move it behind my image, or I could even use my blend mode like we did before to make the shadow and just change it to multiply, and that white area of the mask isn't going to do any darkening on the layer below, and it's just going to get rid of that little white patch that was overlaying it. So if I go back and see my desktop, I'm pretty happy with that. I could continue to refine and fiddle with it, get rid of the white space below featured products, the text there, all that kind of stuff, clean it up. But here's your mobile and your desktop site. You can save it out. It will save both of those together in a single document as an artboard. The last thing I'm going to show you guys is a linked smart object, which is the same thing as a smart object. It just has a couple different attributes. So in order to demonstrate that, I'm going to come back into my two documents and I'm going to delete our logo. So find it there on our mobile site, find it on our desktop in the header group, and delete it there too. And I'm going to come up to File and I'm going to place linked. So rather than an embedded smart object, I'm going to place a linked smart object. I'm going to navigate back out, find my logo in the Assets folder and place it there. It looks exactly like our other smart object. It pauses, lets you place it if you want. I'll go ahead and do that. I'm going to click back up to my mobile version of the site within the header group. Do the exact same thing. Place linked, add the logo. I'll resize it to about the size I want, throw it up there in the corner, and there we have it. Move that down a little bit. So the difference between embedded smart objects and linked smart objects is that a linked smart object actually links back to the original file. So here's our logo. if I open up the original logo file, and let's just say I want to put this on a light blue background, change it right there, hit OK. As soon as I save this, since it's linked to these other two versions of it, it should update to have a blue background in these other two places where it is linked. So if I come to this document, make my change, and hit save, you should see it update real quick right to these other items. And just the same way, if I go into either one of these smart objects where we linked it to, it should also link back to the original. So if I go into that, change it to say green, and hit save and close out, it not only updates here and here, it should also update in your original file. So that can be a super handy thing if you are always putting your logo on a million documents and you know that in the future you're going to be updating your logo and you don't want to have to open all those documents one by one and replace it with the new logo. You could place it as a linked smart object, and when your logo changes, just change that original file and it should update in the other places. Or if, say, you wanted for your Salt and Stone site for the background to change with the seasons, maybe this light green is for spring, you want to be able to have it cascade down and save on 20 different versions of this in, say, an orange or red for fall, and then change it to blue for winter without having to open up all those documents, make that change over and over and over and over, and save, and all that kind of stuff. This can be super handy. So that pretty much wraps up the class and everything we covered. That was a lot faster than we moved in class, so make sure that you pause a lot, take your time with it, review those building blocks, and look through those handouts. There's kind of the flowchart one, which I think is super helpful for knowing where to start when you know you want to create a mask, or create a selection and then a mask, or a mask and then adjust it with a selection. A lot of that stuff can be done in multiple different orders, and it can get very confusing, and I totally understand that. Just spend some time with it, and you guys will get it. You guys all did great in class, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Much appreciated, guys. Take care.